Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Riprap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Strecher, and we're discussing his book, Life on Purpose. Welcome to Riprap.
Thank you very much.
I found this book really interesting, but I think it has its backstory, and it might be helpful to talk about that first.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I have never written a book for the public before like this. I had written a few years ago a graphic novel, and I decided to work with a DC Dark Horse comic book illustrator to write that. It's called On Purpose. But after then giving many talks about that book and my own experiences related to purpose in life and my own scientific research, I got a call from the editor at Harper One, a subsidiary of HarperCollins, and he asked whether I would consider writing maybe a quote real book for this with words, and so I started thinking about that more. The inception of it came when my daughter Julia passed away 5 years ago, and she was born healthy, and she caught a virus when she was 6 months old. I was on sabbatical with the family in Holland, and all sabbatical means is it's a research leave where I was doing research with people in the Netherlands, and our 6-month-old started shrinking, actually losing weight rather than gaining weight, and so we brought her into the hospital there, and after going to doctors many times, and they didn't know what was going on really, finally we took her to the hospital, and after a few days they found that her heart was completely destroyed, that chicken pox virus that she had caught, which normally, babies get chicken pox all the time, but they get a rash and a fever, and after a few days it goes away. And for her, this attacked her heart, this virus attacked it and destroyed it, and her only hope was to get a heart transplant. And we came home, and we had to make a big decision whether to list her for a new heart at all, or whether to just let her die peacefully. And we finally decided we couldn't really let her die. That was too difficult. And at the same time, we thought if we could give her a good life, no matter how many years, we would feel that that was worth it, as long as she wouldn't suffer too much. So we didn't know whether she'd live. First of all, we didn't know whether she'd ever get a new heart. We didn't know how long she'd live, if she lived a year, if she suffered a lot. We didn't know much. And I did a lot of research about this and found that people, even kids who had gotten new hearts, actually had a pretty dramatic improvement in the quality of their lives. But still, no one knew how long that was going to be. So we decided to list her. She became one of the first children in the United States to get a new heart. And we knew at that time we were riding on the wave, the front wave of something that we didn't know what was going to happen to us. We knew our lives were going to change dramatically. And we kind of hung on for the best. And she ended up needing a second heart when she was 9, and I described that in my book. That was very touch and go, as I describe in the book. But I will say that even though she then died when she was 19 years old, she was in nursing school. She had a very strong purpose in her life. She had a wonderful boyfriend. She had many, many people who loved her, and not just her family, but a lot of people. She had a lot of friends, and she had had a lot of amazing experiences. We had gone to Thailand for cooking lessons. A lot of my work takes me around the world. Yeah, that was just a joke. Trillions too many, but I sure have flown a lot, and I've flown around the world many, many times. But I started bringing both of my kids in different independent trips, and I found that very rewarding. Our older daughter, for example, now works for the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., and she works in sub-Saharan Africa, picking out these amazing people who are doing great work, very resilient people, strong purpose. I even write about that in this book. But Julia lived a big life, and then when she was 19, we were in the Caribbean, and we had brought her boyfriend along, and she turned to her boyfriend one night and said, "I'm so happy now that I could die." And she did that night. So,
A lot of people don't know what's involved with the whole thing of having a transplant and then the subsequent care that you have to.
it's a lot. Yeah, having a heart transplant is a very, very serious decision to make, whether you even want to be listed, quite honestly. The drugs are very expensive, so you need very good health insurance. Or you could really end up having to sell your house or go bankrupt because of this. Now I think maybe this is a bit easier with Obamacare, but at least back then we had to worry about a lot of things. And then the quality of her life was very up and down. She was in the hospital a lot. She would get sick very easily. And we never knew how long she would live. So the good part about this, though, and there is a good part, and that's that it changed our lives from black and white into technicolor. We were just living nice, normal lives, and I was striving to get tenure, and I was quite successful, I think, as an academic, and I was moving forward with no problem really, and I thought, oh good, I'll just golf a lot, that sort of thing. I was living this life that was going to do my thing, put in my work, but at the same time, focus on things like golf or tennis or whatever I enjoyed, maybe some travel. But when Julia got sick, it changed our lives forever. And we started living every day as if that day might be our last. And in doing so, we started living bigger lives. It wasn't just her life that became bigger. Like, we really did a lot of things with Julia, but our own lives, we started realizing, wow, do we want to go to our graves with our headstone reading the number of frequent flyer miles I have, or the amount of NIH funding I've gotten, or whatever. I just didn't view that as all that important. The number of journal articles that I've written is not that important to me, quite honestly. What other people think about me is not that important. What I think about me turns out to be extraordinarily important.
And that phrase that you used, the big life, what do you mean by that?
I think there's a big difference between how I was living before Julia got sick and how I lived after Julia got sick and after she died. I would say I was living a very average life and I wasn't sucking the marrow from the bone of life. I was living a pretty standard Midwestern suburban life. And that's not to say it was a bad life, it was fine. But my life after Julia got sick turned into something much more powerful. The bigness of the life. Marcus Aurelius put it very well 2,000 years ago when he said, don't live your life as if you're going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you're here, while you're alive, do good. And I felt that suddenly I was going to die. And I think we tend to ignore our deaths. I think we try to put off death. We don't want to think about it. We don't go to movies that involve death. We eschew that so much. And so death was in our face. We had no choice. And having it so salient in our lives made us think more about not death, but our lives. And that's what death does. It's interesting. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross once said, if each of us every day would think more about their own deaths, we'd have a more peaceful world. Buddhism, Buddhist monks teach that you should think about your death. And they contemplate their deaths and even their own decomposition, which I write about just a bit in my book. And we don't think about that in the society very much. And when you start thinking about that, when that is looming over you, or when your daughter is sick in this way, it makes you start thinking more about life. It's almost as if the Grim Reaper is providing a contrast to the brightness and beauty of life. It's adding this rich contrast. It's adding that shadow that makes the life stand out so much more. And that's what it did for me, and that's what Julia did for me. So that's what I mean by a big life. It's just, as Marcus Aurelius and many Stoic philosophers would do, they'd wake up every morning and say, I think I'm going to die today. Can you imagine doing that? What if you did that? Would your wife go, what? I know my wife would go, stop it. Stop thinking, stop saying that. But when death becomes more prevalent, as Marcus Aurelius and Stoic philosophers would do, like Seneca and many others, Epictetus would wake up, assume they would die, and then they lived much bigger lives. So that's what a big life.
I noticed that you also talked about existential philosophers like Sartre and Camus, and that they didn't become relevant until after you went through this.
You know, I read in my book, and it's very true, that I grew up not really reading philosophy and not caring about it. I thought it was pretty irrelevant. The people who talked about it, I thought, why are you even spouting about this? I'm a scientist. And when Julia died, I turned to philosophy. I read Seneca's letter to Marcia, which is about 20 pages long. Seneca, back in, around 15 AD, was almost the Ann Landers, I think, of ancient Rome. People would write him and say, I have this problem, and he'd write something back. And this woman, Marcia, wrote to him and said, my 16-year-old son died, and now 3 years later I'm still suffering. In fact, more than ever. What should I do? And Seneca wrote this long letter about that. And I really think that the existentialist philosophers were very deeply influenced by these Stoic philosophers, and other Roman, ancient Roman and Greek philosophers who started thinking more about purpose in life, about what it means to exist. And these philosophers, these more modern philosophers like Albert Camus, were amazing. Albert Camus didn't believe in God. He felt that the universe probably had no meaning at all, and yet, as he writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, we have a question then. If we think that the world has no meaning, why don't we all kill ourselves? That's how he starts The Myth of Sisyphus, with that sentence. The big philosophical question is, why don't we kill ourselves? And at the very end, he talks about Sisyphus. It says, even though Sisyphus had this futile thing that he was doing every day, that he had to roll this boulder up this mountain every single day, only to have it roll back down, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So I think Camus was basically saying, as long as you have a purpose, as long as you have a goal that you value, that's what's really important in life. Now, whether life has meaning or not, I don't know. That's a very different question, I think, than whether you have a purpose in your life. And other people, the book, The Purpose-Driven Life, the very first paragraph says, well, you have to have God in order to have a purpose. And I don't believe that. I actually know many people who are atheists. I'm not an atheist, but I know people who are atheists who have very strong, purposeful lives. They live with purpose embedded in them. So I don't believe you have to be a deeply religious person or feel that the universe has meaning. And that's what these existentialist philosophers were discussing and debating. Not all of them were atheists. You had some proto-existentialists such as Soren Kierkegaard, who was extraordinarily religious. But you had other proto-existentialists like Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a strong atheist. God is dead, he said. And they combat each other in a way. But both of them were existentialist philosophers, or proto-existentialists, and they really created this existential movement.
I thought it was interesting also that you had quite a group working with you on this book project. Maybe you'd like to talk about that, because I was pretty impressed, the kinds of people who would contribute, and advise you and look over drafts.
Yeah, I had... I have a friend who's a Hollywood Screenwriter Guild writer. His name is Monty Montgomery, and he is just a lifelong friend to me and an extraordinarily close friend. And he's an excellent writer. He's written children's books before, and he's a screenwriter, so he knows how to tell a story. And he helped me in kind of constructing stories in this book. So I had not written for the popular press before, as I said. I was used to writing journal articles that are, scientific journal articles. And so I really needed to learn how to tell a story. I needed to learn how to build a bit of tension, how to release that tension. I needed to learn how to bookend, a theme, where you may start with a certain theme and you finish up with that theme. You kind of wind in or maybe weave in another theme or two, another story, and you connect them at the dots a little bit later. That for me turned into a fun puzzle. So I love puzzles, and I thought, wow, that would be so much fun to try to connect those pieces. I'm not saying I was great at this, but I just enjoyed it a lot. I had a good time, and I had some very good help.
Well, I've always looked at the community that produces the book as well as the author, because there's this additional element of
my wife, my wife had to help me by really allowing me the time to do this, and in other words, doing my share of the dishes and allowing me to go up to northern Michigan for weeks on end, actually, and be by myself, where I'd wake up at 4 in the morning with an inspiration. I'd literally get up, and in my pajamas I'd make some coffee, and I'd literally work without eating probably until about 10, and without just any change. I'd be inspired and I'd write, and then I'd stop for a while, maybe have some breakfast, and then go back and write again until about 2 o'clock, and then I'd take a break and take a nice long hike, and I'd do that again, and I would keep doing things like that, that type of writing style. I found that my ideas were most creative very early in the morning, and I forced myself to get up. Is that true? Is that true?
Very early in the morning.
Yeah.
Like I've talked to U.S. poet laureates, and one got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, did 2 hours of writing, went to his regular job of running an insurance agency. But it's that early morning, your mind is fresh.
Yeah, and I think, I have a chapter in Life on Purpose about sleep, and I've learned a lot about sleep through the research of sleep as I researched the book. And there's kind of a control mechanism in your brain that turns off, and it allows yourself more freer thinking. It allows yourself to make more connections between different parts of your brain that are normally not connected. And with that freedom of thinking, you're able to come up with a lot of ideas. Now, many of those ideas are totally boneheaded. I mean, really screwy. And you have to wake up then and go back after you've written things, and then in the afternoon you have to edit yourself, and that control mechanism pops back in. It's right in here, by the way, in this prefrontal cortex, and that control mechanism has to go back and start editing your work. And it turns out that the best poets and best writers are able to modulate that really effectively. They're able to freely think, and then able to turn on the control mechanism, and then again freely think. So there's a certain style. And I found myself getting into a wonderful rhythm last summer as I was writing this book. Every morning I would wake up very early, and I would push myself into saying, chapter 4, I don't know how to start this chapter, or chapter 6, how do I begin this? And sometimes in these chapters I'd literally write most of it in one day.
Well, Peter Elbow talks about free writing.
Pre-writing.
Free writing.
Oh, free writing.
In other words, letting yourself speak and then shaping it after. But the free writing, you don't do any editing. You just get it off on paper. Yeah. So then you can see where you want to go. And maybe it's good and maybe it's bad, but at least you've got it out. One thing that a writer told me is, since I do a lot of speaking, I don't do a lot of writing for the public, but I do a lot of speaking for the public. And I'm really used to doing that. So she said, just go ahead and continue speaking. Just write as if you're speaking. And just write, type, as you're speaking. And just see where that goes. And then you can edit it later. And that was extraordinarily helpful. Well, I teach writing at the college level.
Oh, you do? Great. Wow.
And one of the things I've learned over the years, the best writers have what they call a compost pile. And that's where they've written something. Yeah, and they stick it off into that, and then they come back to it. And they may or may not be ready to do anything with it, or it may or may not be good, but it's something they've written that they set aside because they can't quite see how it fits.
I understand. I understand. That's very interesting.
Writers understand that. People don't understand it. But
I totally understand this. In fact, the one thing that I want to do, if this book is at all successful, my intention is hopefully to write other books down the road. And so I'm starting to try to become more aware of situations that might be interesting for future books, and just simply write them down and write short stories and just keep writing those. And like you say, some, you just pile those up and you see what may make sense.
Some may work and some may not, and some may be wonderful.
Yeah.
One of the things you did in the book was to make a connection between purpose and happiness.
Yeah.
And maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is a strong connection between purpose and happiness, in the sense of Aristotle talking about the question of happiness. He said happiness should be the ultimate goal. And he said, well, there's two trains of thought about what gives you happiness. One is pleasure, and that's typically what we in the West now view as happiness. That's our conception of happiness. But he said that's hedonic pleasure, or hedonism, and we all know what hedonism is. That's the pursuit of pleasure, whether it's good food or wine or sex or whatever that is. It's some pleasurable experience. And then there's what he called eudaimonic happiness. And he said this is when you're in touch with your inner daimon. The daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N, although it is spelled a little differently in different places, and it's also pronounced differently in different places. It's pronounced daemon by some people, but typically it's daimon. And this inner self, he said, your daimon is your true self. And when you find your true self and live in alignment with your true self, in accordance with the self, then you're truly happy. And in fact, he said, it's okay to be hedonic, it's okay to have hedonism, food, wine, sex, all those things are fine, and we all understand that those are pleasurable and things to pursue. And yet, if that's all we pursue, he said, then we're like grazing animals. And I found that fascinating, that he divides the two out. And what I found even more fascinating is that now there are scientists such as Barbara Fredrickson from the University of North Carolina and others who have said, well, let's look at this eudaimonic well-being or happiness and compare it against people who are primarily hedonically happy and see what the differences are. And one thing that she found is that while both of them are happy, they are 180 degrees different physiologically. That the people who are just simply, or by and large, hedonically happy, they're pleasure seekers, have much more inflammatory cell production. And inflammatory cells are not good. That's what causes diabetes, it causes heart disease, it causes cancers, it causes all sorts of horrible things. We don't want this inflammatory cell production to the extent that that's caused. It's actually good to a certain extent, but you don't want what they have. And then antibodies, which are good for you, that's predominating in people who are eudaimonically happy. So I found that absolutely fascinating. And here, Aristotle, 2,400 years ago, is finding this. I think that's fascinating.
Well, in your book, you gave some really interesting statistics about the value of that kind of living.
Yeah, people who live with strong eudaimonic purpose, who are in touch with their inner self, their true self, live longer. They are less likely to develop heart disease, less likely to develop stroke, less likely to develop depression 10 years later, half as likely. They're also, if they're seniors, they're 2.4 times less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease 7 years later. Now that's pretty stunning. They have all sorts of good things that happen to them. They have more friends, they have better sex, they have lots of things. So imagine a drug that did all of those things. If that were a drug you could just take every day, it would be a multi-billion-dollar drug, wouldn't it? And it would be, or it'd be in our drinking water. It'd be something we all needed to have. And the people who developed it would be Nobel Prize winners, without doubt. But I think that since purpose in life is this almost a spiritual and ephemeral thing that you can't really touch, it's not the pressure exerted in the interior walls of a blood vessel. As long as it's not a molecule or something that you can measure, through our physical instruments, people say, well, I don't want to study it. And I would say, no, I think we should study those things. And thank goodness many of our colleagues around the world are brave enough to study things like that, even though they're difficult to measure.
And you identified several different kinds of activities that enhance the purpose in someone's life.
Yeah. So many people in talks that I've given about purpose say, well, I don't have a purpose. How do I find one? And I want to simplify this and almost despiritualize it a little bit, Jim. I view purpose as a goal that is deeply valued, or a set of goals that are deeply valued. Another way to think about that is to think about your core values and say, I would like to operationalize my core values as goals. To give you an example, I care very much about my spouse. I deeply value my spouse. So I'm going to set as a goal to be more engaged daily with my spouse. That becomes a purpose in my life. Or I care deeply about the students that I teach at the University of Michigan. So a goal that I set is to teach every one of my students as if they're my own daughter, Julia. That's my purpose. Or I really value having a life of purpose, and I wish that our world had greater purpose in its life. And I really wish we would be less nihilistic and maybe spend less time watching reality television. I really don't care what Kim Kardashian is doing or who she's marrying. I don't care what what Paris Hilton's new dog's name is. I don't care about those things whatsoever. And I worry that we care so much about those things and don't even know the names of our neighbors. When that happens, I think we're losing our culture, we're losing our purpose in our lives, we're losing meaning, and we're losing our existence, a big life. So the operationalization of that care, of that thing that I value, is to help over 1 billion people find greater purpose in their lives. So that's one way to think about it, and that's one step. Another step in thinking about purpose is to break it into different domains. We all have a personal purpose we can create for ourselves. Mine is to enjoy love and beauty, which, by the way, is very hedonic. It's very selfish. So I like a nice car, I like a nice house, I like a nice meal. I like those things, and I seek those. And, so I don't care what other people think about that. I care about that. And, but I have a family purpose of being an engaged husband, engaged father, engaged son, and now an engaged grandfather, because our daughter Rachel just had a new baby. So those I've set as my family purpose. And then I have a work purpose to teach every one of my students as if they're my own daughter. And I have this community purpose, global purpose, to help over 1 billion people find purpose in their lives. And so breaking it into those domains makes it easier for me. Another way to think about this, in terms of, if you want to prompt or stimulate purpose in your life, is thinking about what might be on your headstone. So a lot of people don't like to do this because, especially in the West, we don't like to think about the Grim Reaper, this odd fact that we all die, we seem to not want to talk about at all. But it does happen, and I've thought a lot about what would be on my headstone. I thought a lot about what I'd want people to say at my memorial service about me. I thought about which people I'd like to have stand up at my memorial service and say, Vic helped me. I was a student and I saw Vic and he changed my life. He changed the path I was on, and now I'm much happier and I'm doing X, Y, and Z and helping people or whatever. I would like to see that. And so that helps me define my purpose. All of those things are very important.
Well, thank you for being on Riprap.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.